There are moments in a woman's life when she understands with perfect and terrible clarity that she has been a fool, and for Eleanor Ashworth that moment had crystallized 6 years ago on a summer afternoon that smelled of roses and champagne, though the memory of it haunted her still on this grey autumn evening as she sat at her small writing desk in the modest bedchamber she had occupied since childhood, her fingers trembling slightly as they held the letter she had never sent, the letter that had destroyed her nonetheless, its paper now soft and worn at the creases from the countless times she had unfolded it in the dark hours of the night, not to read the words she knew by heart, but to remind herself of the cost of romantic foolishness, of what happened to penniless vicars' daughters who dared to dream above their station. The light was fading beyond the window, casting the room in shades of pewter and shadow, and Eleanor's amber-brown eyes, which her mother had once called honey in sunlight, seemed darker now, the colour of autumn leaves before the storm, as she traced the familiar loops of her own 17-year-old handwriting, and remembered, oh, how she remembered, the garden party at Lady Morton's estate, the way the afternoon sun had dappled through the ornamental trees, the sound of genteel laughter floating across the manicured lawns, and Henry Blackwell standing at the centre of a circle of admirers, his golden hair catching the light, his blue eyes dancing with cruel amusement as he held aloft a piece of paper he had found in her writing desk during a visit to the vicarage, a piece of paper she had hidden so carefully, a confession of love she had never intended anyone to see. She could still hear his voice, that practiced, theatrical voice, reading her most private words aloud to the assembled company, while she stood frozen at the edge of the gathering, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but watch her heart be publicly dissected for entertainment. "My dearest Henry, I confess I can no longer keep silent the feelings that have grown within my heart," he had read, his tone mocking each earnest phrase, and when he had finished, when the laughter had reached its crescendo, he had looked directly at her with those beautiful, empty eyes, and declared for all to hear, a penniless vicar's daughter, with romantic delusions above her station, she should set her cap at the curate, more suited to her circumstances. The humiliation had been witnessed by half the county's society, and Eleanor had learned that day that some wounds never fully heal, they simply become part of the architecture of the soul, shaping everything that follows. Now, 6 years later, she rose from her desk and carried the letter to the small fire burning in her grate, and as she held the paper to the flames, she pressed her right hand flat against her stomach, holding herself together as she always did when the feelings threatened to overwhelm her, and she watched her 17-year-old hopes turn to ash, the scent of wood smoke filling her small chamber with its bitter-sweet perfume. She had learned her lesson well, she told herself, as the last corner of the letter blackened and curled. Love was not for women like her, women without fortune or exceptional beauty, women whose only currency was dignity and usefulness. And she would never be so foolish again, never expose her heart to such devastation, never forget that security and purpose were ambitions enough for a life. And if sometimes in the quiet hours she ached for something more, something she dared not name, she had become expert at pressing that longing down, 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 until it was nothing but a whisper she could almost pretend not to hear. The morning that followed brought no warmth to the vicarage, though Eleanor had risen before dawn to coax the fires in the parlour and kitchen into something resembling life, and still the chill crept through the old stone walls and settled into the bones of the house as stubbornly as it settled into her father's joints, which she pretended not to notice had grown stiffer with each passing season, just as she pretended not to notice the way he paused now at the top of the stairs to catch his breath, or the tremor in his hands when he lifted his teacup, or the increasing frequency with which he lost his place in familiar passages of Scripture he had once known as intimately as his own heartbeat. Reverend Thomas Ashworth had served this parish for 32 years, had baptized its children and buried its dead and spoken words of comfort into the darkest hours of countless souls, and Eleanor loved him with a fierce, protective tenderness that made her throat ache as she helped him into his worn black coat, smoothing the fabric across his shoulders with hands that were steady, even when her heart was not, adjusting his collar with the same careful attention she had learned from her mother before consumption had claimed her when Eleanor was barely 12 years old. "You fuss too much, my dear," her father said, his voice carrying the gentle humour that had sustained them both through lean years and lonely ones, and Eleanor smiled and said nothing, because what was there to say when the man who had been her entire world was growing frailer before her eyes, and she was powerless to stop it, powerless to do anything but tend to him with quiet competence and pretend that love alone could hold back the inevitable. They walked together to the church through air that smelled of fallen leaves and distant rain, and Eleanor matched her pace to his slower one without acknowledgement, pointing out the autumn colours in the hedgerows, as though she had not noticed how often he needed to rest now. And when they reached the vestry, she helped him arrange his notes and filled the communion vessels, and performed the 100 small tasks that had become her province over the years, the work of a wife, without the title, the labour of devotion that asked nothing in return. It was after the service, after the parishioners had filed out with their murmured blessings, and the church had emptied into its familiar echoing silence, that the letter arrived, brought by a boy from the village who had been paid a penny to deliver it from the coaching inn, and Eleanor knew before she broke the bishop's seal that whatever news it contained would not be good, knew it in the way the autumn light fell cold and grey through the vestry window, knew it in the sudden heaviness that settled in her chest as her fingers found the crescent-shaped scar at the corner of her left eyebrow and pressed against it in the old nervous habit she had never been able to break. The words swam before her eyes at first, formal ecclesiastical language that took several readings to fully comprehend. Her father's retirement had been mandated effective within 3 months due to concerns about his health. The living would be transferred to a new clergyman already selected. They would need to vacate the vicarage to make way for his arrival. The bishop extended his gratitude for Reverend Ashworth's years of faithful service and his prayers for a peaceful retirement. Eleanor read the letter twice more, her practised composure holding even as the foundations of her world crumbled beneath her feet, and then she folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket, and began to calculate with the clear-eyed practicality that had become her armour against a world that offered women like her so few weapons. Her father's savings would sustain them for perhaps a year in modest lodgings, perhaps 18 months, if they were very careful. But after that, there would be nothing. And she had no marriage prospects, no fortune, no connections that might secure her respectable employment. For a gentleman's daughter could not work as a governess without references from society that had long since forgotten her existence, could not open a shop or take in sewing without sacrificing the last vestiges of the dignity that was all she had left. Her father found her standing by the window, staring out at the grey autumn day, and when she handed him the letter and watched his face as he read it, she saw not despair, but a strange, quiet acceptance. And when he looked up at her, his eyes held something she could not quite name. Faith, perhaps, or simply the peace of a man who had long since learned to trust in forces beyond his understanding. "God works through unexpected instruments, my dear," he said softly, reaching out to take her cold hand in his warm, trembling one. "The coldest stone may yet shelter the warmest hearth." And Eleanor wanted to believe him, wanted to find comfort in his gentle certainty. But she had learned 6 years ago that hope was a luxury she could not afford, and so she simply squeezed his hand and said nothing, and tried not to think about the darkness gathering on the horizon of their small, precarious lives. 3 days passed in a haze of quiet desperation, Eleanor moving through the familiar rhythms of the vicarage with the mechanical precision of a woman who dared not stop to think too deeply about the future that loomed before her like a gathering storm. and she was in the parlour mending one of her father's shirts, when the sound of hooves on the gravel drive made her look up, her needle pausing mid-stitch as she watched through the window. A carriage of such obvious expense and elegance that it seemed almost an affront to the modest lane it travelled, black lacquered sides gleaming even beneath the overcast sky, matched grey horses stamping with barely contained energy as a footman leapt down to open the door, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she recognised the man who emerged, Lord William Thornton, the Duke of Ashford, whom she had seen only from a distance at church, a tall, broad-shouldered figure who sat alone in the family pew and spoke to no one, whose grey-blue eyes seemed to look through the congregation rather than at them, whose reputation for coldness and pride had only grown in the 5 years since he had inherited the title from his father. She rose from her chair, as though pulled by invisible strings, her hand pressing flat against her stomach in that old familiar gesture, and she was still standing frozen in the centre of the parlour when the knock came at the door, and her father emerged from his study with a puzzled expression that mirrored her own bewilderment. And then the Duke was in their home, filling the modest space with his presence in a way that made the walls themselves seem to shrink. And as he passed Eleanor in the narrow doorway, she caught his scent, sandalwood and leather, with an undertone of wood smoke, and something in her chest tightened inexplicably. He wasted no time on pleasantries, declining the tea her father offered with a curt shake of his head, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and clipped and utterly without warmth. He required a wife, he said, to satisfy the demands of his estate and the expectations of his family legacy. He had observed Miss Ashworth for some time, and found her to possess the qualities he sought: intelligence, dignity, breeding despite her lack of fortune, and most importantly, she was unlikely to trouble him with romantic expectations. And in exchange for her hand, he would provide security for both her and her father for the remainder of their lives, a comfortable cottage on his estate, a generous allowance, the protection of his name and his resources against whatever the future might hold. Eleanor listened with a strange ringing in her ears, her mind racing through calculations even as her heart seemed to have stopped entirely. And when he finished speaking, and turned those winter-sky eyes upon her, waiting for her answer with an expression that revealed nothing of what he might be feeling, she heard herself asking for a day to consider. And she watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, watched something flash in those grey-blue depths before he mastered it and inclined his head in stiff acknowledgment. "I give you my word, Miss Ashworth," he said, and for the first time his voice held something other than cold practicality, something almost fierce beneath the formal words. "I shall never humiliate you, whatever else this marriage may lack. You will always have my respect and my protection." And then he was gone, leaving behind only the fading scent of sandalwood and the echo of a promise that seemed to reach across the years to touch the wound Henry Blackwell had carved into her soul. Later, alone in the garden where the last autumn roses clung stubbornly to their thorny stems, Eleanor walked the familiar paths and wrestled with the impossible choice before her: a loveless marriage to a cold stranger, or destitution and disgrace for herself and her father, and she thought of unexpected instruments and cold stones sheltering warm hearths, and she pressed her hand against her stomach and made herself a promise, speaking it aloud to the grey sky as though the words themselves could make it true. "I will not love him," she whispered. "I will be grateful. I will be dutiful. I will be content, but I will not love him. I cannot survive that wound twice." The morning of her wedding dawned cold and clear, the kind of brittle winter light that made everything appear sharper than it truly was, and Eleanor stood before the small mirror in her bedchamber, and looked at the woman reflected there, pale, composed, wearing her mother's simple wedding dress of ivory silk that had yellowed slightly with age, but still fell in graceful lines that spoke of a gentler time, a time when her mother had worn it with joy and hope, and all the tender expectations of a young bride who believed in love. And she wondered what that long-dead woman would think of her daughter now, marrying a stranger for security, marrying a man whose eyes held all the warmth of a January frost, marrying because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Her father performed the ceremony himself, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, and the church was nearly empty save for a few curious villagers who had heard whispers of the Duke's inexplicable choice and come to witness what they could not quite believe. And Eleanor stood beside William Thornton at the altar and felt the cold draught from the ancient door seeping through the stones, felt it until suddenly she did not. And when she glanced up, she realized he had shifted his position, placing his broad shoulders between her and the source of the chill, a small gesture that might have meant nothing, or might have meant everything. She could not tell. His vows were spoken clearly and without hesitation, his deep voice filling the small church with a resonance that seemed to settle into her very bones. And when he took her hand to place the ring upon her finger, she was startled by the warmth of his palm, the steadiness of his grip, and when he spoke the words, "With all my worldly goods I thee endow," he looked at her, truly looked at her, his grey-blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. And for one fleeting moment she thought she saw something flicker in those winter depths, something that was not coldness at all, though it vanished before she could name it. The carriage ride to Thornton Hall passed in silence, the two of them sitting on opposite seats with a careful distance between them, and Eleanor watched the countryside roll past the window and tried not to think about what awaited her, tried not to think about the vast estate she had only ever seen from a distance, tried not to think about the wedding night, or the years that would follow, or the promise she had made to herself in the garden. And when she shivered, from cold or nerves or something she could not name, she saw him move from the corner of her eye, saw him remove his coat with economical grace, and lean forward to place it around her shoulders, his hands careful not to brush her skin, respecting the boundaries of their arrangement, even as he fulfilled his promise to provide for her comfort, and the scent of sandalwood and leather and wood smoke enveloped her like an embrace she had not asked for and did not know how to refuse. "You will want for nothing, madam," he said, his voice low and formal in the intimate space of the carriage. "I keep my promises." And Eleanor drew his coat closer around her shoulders and breathed in that unfamiliar scent, and wondered what manner of man she had married, this cold stranger who blocked draughts and offered warmth, and looked at her as though he saw something worth seeing, and she pressed her hand flat against her stomach beneath the heavy fabric of his coat, and reminded herself of her vow, reminded herself that she would not love him, could not love him, even as some small treacherous part of her heart whispered that perhaps, the coldest stone might yet shelter the warmest hearth. Thornton Hall rose before them like a great stone sentinel against the darkening sky, its countless windows catching the last grey light of the winter afternoon as the carriage swept through iron gates and up a drive lined with ancient oaks, whose bare branches reached toward the heavens like supplicating arms, and Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest as the full magnitude of what she had done settled upon her with crushing weight. She was mistress of this place now, this vast edifice of wealth and history and cold grandeur, she who had never commanded more than a single aging housemaid and a cook who came 3 days a week, she who had mended her own stockings and darned her father's shirts, and counted every candle as though it were made of gold. The carriage rolled to a stop before a portico of pale stone columns, and before Eleanor could gather herself, a footman had opened the door, and William was handing her down with that same careful formality, his fingers barely brushing hers through her gloves, and she was aware of the servants assembled in precise formation on the steps, a sea of black and white uniforms and carefully neutral faces that watched her with the particular scrutiny reserved for those who had risen above their expected station. And at their head stood a woman of perhaps 50 years, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe knot, and eyes that missed nothing, eyes that swept over Eleanor with cool assessment, and found her, it seemed, wanting. "Mrs. Hartwell," William said, his voice carrying that clipped formality Eleanor was beginning to recognize as his armor against the world. "May I present the Duchess of Ashford?" And the housekeeper curtsied with perfect precision and murmured words of welcome that held all the warmth of the January wind that cut through Eleanor's borrowed coat. And Eleanor understood with painful clarity that this woman had known William since his birth, had loved him in her own fierce way, and would not easily accept a stranger who had appeared from nowhere to claim a place at his side. The tour of the house that followed, blurred into an endless procession of grand rooms and priceless furnishings, of portraits staring down from gilded frames and fireplaces large enough to roast an ox. And Eleanor nodded and murmured appropriate responses, while her mind reeled with the impossibility of ever belonging in such a place. And it was only when they paused in a corridor, and she heard voices drifting from an open doorway, that she caught the words that would echo in her memory for years to come. Mrs. Hartwell speaking to another servant in low tones that were not quite low enough. "Mark my words, that girl will be the making of him, or the breaking. There is no middle ground with a heart like his." Eleanor's step faltered, her hand pressing instinctively against her stomach. But William either had not heard or chose to pretend he had not, for he merely gestured toward a door at the end of the corridor and said, with something that might almost have been uncertainty in his voice, "Your chambers, madam. I had them prepared according to what I thought you might prefer." And when he opened the door, Eleanor stepped into a room that stole her breath entirely, not for its grandeur, though it was grand, with silk hangings of deep rose and cream and furniture of polished mahogany, but for the fire already blazing in the hearth, for the vase of winter jasmine on the dressing-table whose sweet scent filled the air, and most of all for the bookshelf beside the window, filled with volumes whose spines she recognized with a shock of bewildered recognition. Her favorite poets, her beloved novels, the philosophical treatises she had discussed with her father on long winter evenings, all arranged as though someone had reached into her heart and pulled forth its secret treasures. "How did you know?" she whispered before she could stop herself, and William's jaw tightened in that way she was learning to recognize, his gaze sliding away toward the window where the first drops of rain had begun to strike the glass. "You mentioned them," he said stiffly. "To your father when I called upon you, I overheard." And he was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone with the fire and the jasmine and the inexplicable evidence that this cold stranger had been paying attention in ways she had never imagined. That night, as the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke with a fury that rattled the windows and sent shadows dancing across the unfamiliar walls, Eleanor found she could not sleep. The bed was too soft, the room too large, the silence between thunderclaps too complete. And so she wrapped herself in a shawl and ventured out into the darkened corridor, drawn by some instinct she could not name toward the library she had glimpsed during the tour. A vast room of leather and mahogany, and the comforting scent of old books. She found him there, standing at the window with a glass of something amber in his hand, watching the lightning split the sky, and he turned when she entered with an expression she could not read. And she was about to stammer an apology for intruding when the lights flickered once, twice, and then died entirely, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the intermittent flash of lightning. And she gasped and stumbled, and then his hand was at her elbow, steadying her, and the warmth of his palm burned through the thin fabric of her sleeve like a brand, like a promise, like something she had no name for. And for a long moment neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, and when he finally released her, it was slowly, reluctantly, his fingers trailing along her arm, as though he could not quite bear to break the contact. And they stood there in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside, while something shifted between them, something fragile and new and terrifying. And Eleanor pressed her hand against her stomach, and reminded herself of her vow, and knew, with a certainty that frightened her to her very soul, that keeping it would be far harder than she had ever imagined. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor had become the Duchess of Ashford. 2 weeks of learning the rhythms of a house that seemed to breathe with its own ancient life, and she had discovered in that time that her husband was a mystery wrapped in contradictions. For the cold and distant Duke who spoke to her in clipped formalities at dinner was not, it seemed, the same man who rose before dawn each morning to ride the frost-silvered grounds of his estate, who met personally with every tenant farmer and knew their children's names and their struggles and their hopes. The servants spoke of him differently than society did, she noticed, not with the fearful deference one might expect from those who served a man of his reputation, but with genuine respect and something that looked almost like affection. And Mrs. Hartwell, whose cool assessment had not yet thawed toward Eleanor herself, softened visibly whenever she spoke of his grace, her stern features gentling in ways that spoke of decades of loyalty earned rather than demanded. It was on a morning of pale autumn sunshine, the first true warmth breaking through the grey that had shrouded Thornton Hall since her arrival, that Eleanor ventured beyond the formal gardens and found herself walking a path that wound through a small copse of birch trees toward the tenant cottages she had seen only from a distance. And she was about to turn back, uncertain of her welcome in this part of the estate she did not yet know, when she heard voices ahead and recognized one of them with a start that stopped her feet upon the path. William stood before a modest cottage with a thatched roof and a garden gone to seed, and before him was a young man whose face bore the ravaged look of fresh grief, and clustered around his legs were 3 small children, the youngest no more than 3 years old, with a thumb planted firmly in her mouth and eyes that held the bewildered sorrow of one too young to understand why her mother would never return. Eleanor pressed herself against the trunk of a birch tree, her heart pounding with the fear of discovery. But neither William nor the grieving farmer noticed her presence, and so she watched as her husband, this man she had married for security and nothing more, this man whose coldness was legendary throughout the county, spoke to the young widower in a voice she had never heard him use, low and gentle and filled with a compassion that seemed utterly at odds with everything she thought she knew of him. He did not offer empty platitudes or distant sympathy. Instead, he spoke of practical matters, of the woman he would send from the hall to help with the children, of the reduction in rent until the family found their footing, of the arrangements he would make for the eldest child to attend the village school, and when the smallest girl tugged at his coat with one chubby hand, William did something that shattered every assumption Eleanor had built around him like a fortress. He crouched down, heedless of the mud that stained his immaculate riding boots, and met the child at eye level, and his voice dropped to something almost tender, as he promised her that she would be looked after, that her father would not face this alone, that sometimes the people we love must go away, but that does not mean we are forgotten. Eleanor's hand pressed flat against her stomach, that old gesture of holding herself together. But this time it was not pain she was containing, but something far more dangerous, something that felt like the first green shoot of spring pushing through frozen ground. And she turned and fled back toward the hall before he could see her, before he could know that she had witnessed the man beneath the mask, the warmth, beneath the winter. At breakfast that morning, seated across from him at the vast mahogany table that could have held 30 guests, but held only 2, Eleanor gathered her courage and said quietly, "I wished to thank you, Your Grace, for the books in my chambers. It was most thoughtful." And she watched as something flickered across his face. Surprise, discomfort, a vulnerability quickly shuttered, and his jaw tightened in that way she was learning to recognize before he looked away toward the window and said, with awkward stiffness, "You mentioned them. To your father, I overheard," as though remembering the literary preferences of a woman he barely knew, and filling an entire bookshelf with her favorites was nothing remarkable, as though anyone would have done the same. And Eleanor understood then with a clarity that took her breath away that this was how he showed care, not through flowery words or romantic gestures, but through attention, through memory, through quiet acts of thoughtfulness that spoke louder than any declaration. And she pressed her hand against her stomach and felt something shift within her heart, something that was not yet love, but was no longer merely gratitude, something warm and tentative and terrifying that whispered of possibilities she had sworn never to consider again. The gardens of Thornton Hall had been designed, Eleanor suspected, by someone who understood that beauty could be a kind of solace, for even in the depths of winter they possessed a quiet dignity, the bones of their structure visible beneath the dormant beds and bare-branched trees. And on this particular afternoon, rare and mild, with a softness in the air that hinted at the spring still months away, she had ventured beyond the formal parterre to explore the wilder reaches of the grounds, her shawl wrapped loosely about her shoulders, and her thoughts drifting in that pleasant aimlessness that had begun to characterize her days at Thornton Hall, when she heard the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush and turned just in time to see an enormous hound barreling toward her with the enthusiastic abandon of a creature who had never learned that dignity was expected of those who resided in ducal households. The dog was grey about the muzzle and moved with the slightly stiff gait of advanced age, but his eyes were bright with joy, and his tail wagged with such ferocious energy that his entire hindquarters swayed with the motion. And before Eleanor could brace herself or step aside, he had launched himself at her with all the force of his considerable bulk, his great paws landing squarely upon her chest and sending her stumbling backward into the hedge behind her, with a startled cry and a tremendous rustling of leaves and snapping of small branches. She found herself half sitting, half lying in a tangle of twigs and winter-bare stems, her skirts askew and her hair escaping its pins in wild tendrils, while the hound stood over her with an expression of pure canine delight, his tongue lolling and his tail still wagging as though he had accomplished something magnificent rather than catastrophic. And she was attempting to extricate herself from the hedge with what little remained of her dignity when she heard footsteps approaching rapidly, and William's voice calling out with sharp concern, "Wellington, down! What have you—" And then he stopped, and Eleanor looked up from her undignified position to see her husband standing frozen on the path, his face caught in an expression of such genuine shock that for one terrible moment she thought he was angry, thought she had somehow transgressed by allowing his dog to assault her person. And then something extraordinary happened. His lips twitched, his eyes crinkled at the corners, and a sound emerged from his chest that she had never heard before. A laugh, a real laugh, rich and warm and utterly surprised out of him, as though he had forgotten such sounds existed, and his whole face transformed in that moment from stern marble to something alive and warm and almost boyish. And Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, because she had not known, had not imagined, that he could look like this, that beneath the cold reserve was a man capable of such unguarded joy. "Wellington has excellent taste," he managed, between subsiding chuckles, crossing to her and extending both hands to help her rise. "He has never liked anyone so immediately." And his hands were warm and strong on her arms as he lifted her from the hedge, steadying her with the same careful attention he had shown that night in the darkened library, and she became suddenly acutely aware of how close he stood, of the way his grey-blue eyes had warmed to something softer, of the lingering curve of his smile, and she thought with a flutter of panic that he was handsome, truly handsome, when he was not guarding himself against the world. They walked the gardens together after that, Wellington padding contentedly at their heels, and conversation flowed between them more easily than it ever had, and when they came upon a section of the grounds that had clearly once been magnificent, but now lay choked with weeds and wild growth, William's expression shifted to something more complex, something that held both sorrow and tenderness, and he said quietly, "My mother's rose garden. She planted every bush herself. I have not had the heart to tend it since—" And he stopped, his jaw tightening in that familiar way, and Eleanor heard herself saying, before she could think better of it, "I could restore it, if you would permit me. I should like very much to see it bloom again." And the look he gave her then, grateful and wondering, and something more, something that made her press her hand against her stomach in that old gesture of self-protection, told her that she had offered him a gift far greater than she had intended. And as they walked back toward the hall in the fading afternoon light, she felt the first stirring of attraction move through her like a warning, like a promise, like something she had sworn never to feel again. And she was terrified. 5 weeks had passed since Eleanor Ashworth had spoken her wedding vows in the small village church. 5 weeks since she had stepped into a life she could never have imagined for herself. And in that time she had discovered something remarkable, that contentment could grow in the most unexpected soil, taking root in the quiet rhythms of days that flowed one into another with a gentle predictability she had never known she craved. The great house of Thornton Hall, which had seemed so overwhelming upon her arrival, had begun to feel less like a monument to ducal grandeur and more like a home, its corridors becoming familiar beneath her feet, its rooms revealing their secrets and their comforts as she learned to navigate them with the confidence of one who belonged. Mrs. Hartwell's cool assessment had thawed by degrees, the older woman's sharp eyes following Eleanor as she went about the business of learning her duties. And though the housekeeper said little at first, Eleanor noticed that the silences between them had grown less pointed, the glances less suspicious, until one afternoon when Eleanor had spent the better part of 3 hours reviewing the household accounts and suggesting a more efficient arrangement for the linen stores, Mrs. Hartwell had paused in the doorway of the morning room and said, with a gruffness that could not quite disguise the warmth beneath, "You have done well, my lady, better than I expected, better than I hoped." And Eleanor had felt something ease in her chest, some tension she had not known she was carrying, because to be accepted by this woman who had guarded the Duke and his household for 30 years felt like a victory more meaningful than any society triumph could have been. The small rituals of her marriage had become the architecture of her days, breakfast with William in the vast dining room that seemed less cavernous now that she had grown accustomed to it, his presence across the table a steadying constant, even when their conversation consisted of little more than comments about the weather or the estate. Evening reading in the library where she had first felt the warmth of his hand at her elbow, each of them absorbed in their own books, but somehow together in the companionable silence. Walks through the grounds with Wellington padding faithfully at their heels, the old dog having appointed himself Eleanor's devoted guardian, with a loyalty that made William's lips twitch in that almost smile she was learning to treasure. He still spoke little, her husband, but his silences had transformed from walls into something more like windows, and she had begun to read the language of his restraint, the way his eyes followed her across a room, the way his hand would reach toward her and then withdraw as though he had thought better of the impulse, the way he lingered over breakfast, when surely a man of his responsibilities had better things to do than watch his wife butter her toast. The rose garden had become her sanctuary and her project, and she worked in it daily now, clearing the years of neglect from beds that had once been glorious, her hands growing rough and her fingernails perpetually rimmed with soil despite her best efforts. And it was on one such afternoon, kneeling in the cold earth with her gardening gloves worn through at the fingertips, that she discovered the stone bench half hidden beneath a cascade of overgrown climbing roses, its surface weathered and grey, but still bearing the carved initials that made her heart clench with sudden understanding. M.T., his mother, Margaret Thornton, the woman whose death had shaped the man William had become. And Eleanor did not mention her discovery to him, But she tended the area around that bench with special care, clearing the weeds and pruning back the wild growth until the stone could breathe again, until it stood as a quiet memorial in the garden his mother had loved. That evening, standing at her chamber window as the last light faded from the sky, Eleanor looked out toward the rose garden and saw a figure silhouetted against the grey dusk. And she knew him instantly by the breadth of his shoulders and the way he held himself. And she watched as William stood at the library window below her, his hand pressed flat against the glass, as though reaching for something beyond it, his face unreadable in the gathering darkness, but his posture speaking of a longing she recognized because she felt it too. And she pressed her own hand against her stomach, in that old gesture of self-protection, and wondered when contentment had begun to feel so much like the beginning of something more, something she had sworn she would never allow herself to want again. 6 weeks had passed since Eleanor had become the Duchess of Ashford, and sleep had become an elusive companion on this particular night, her thoughts circling like restless birds through the darkened chambers of her mind. And so she had risen from her bed and wrapped herself in a shawl, and ventured into the corridor with the intention of finding a book, something dull enough to quiet the strange restlessness that had taken hold of her since that afternoon in the rose garden, when she had watched her husband standing at the window, with his hand pressed against the glass, like a man reaching for something he could not name. And it was as she passed the corridor that led to his study that she noticed the thin line of golden light spilling beneath the door, a beacon in the darkness of the sleeping house, and she hesitated there for a long moment, her hand raised to knock and then lowering again, uncertain whether she had the right to intrude upon whatever solitude he sought at this late hour. But something compelled her forward, some instinct she could not have explained, and she knocked softly and heard his voice, low and surprised, bid her enter. He was seated in a leather chair before the dying fire, a book open in his lap, though she suspected he had not been reading it, and when he saw her standing in the doorway in her night-clothes with her shawl clutched about her shoulders and her hair loose down her back, something flickered across his features. Surprise, yes, but not displeasure. Something almost like relief, as though he had been waiting for her without knowing it. And he gestured to the chair opposite his own without speaking, and she crossed the room and settled into it. And for a time they simply sat together in the near darkness, the fire burning low and casting shadows that danced across the walls, the silence between them comfortable in a way that would have seemed impossible mere weeks ago. She had taken up a volume of poetry from the table beside her chair, and was pretending to read it when he began to speak, his voice rough and halting, his eyes fixed on the embers, as though he could not bear to look at her while he said the words. And he told her about his mother, how she had died when he was 12, how the fever had taken her in 3 days, while he sat helpless outside her chamber door, how his father had emerged from that room a changed man, cold and demanding, speaking of duty and legacy, as though love were a weakness to be excised from the heart like a cancer. And then his voice dropped lower still, barely more than a whisper, and he said, "I cannot remember her voice any more. I have tried. I have tried so many times to hear her in my memory, but it is gone. And it haunts me that I have lost even that." And Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, some wall she had not known she was still building, and she did not speak because there were no words adequate to such grief. But she rose from her chair and crossed the small distance between them and sat beside him on the settee, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and in the darkness his hand found hers, his fingers warm and strong as they interlaced with her own, and they sat together without speaking, as the fire burned down to ash and the room grew cold around them. But she felt nothing of the chill because his hand was holding hers, as though she were an anchor in a storm he had been weathering alone for 19 years. And when at last she rose to leave, Knowing that propriety demanded she return to her own chambers, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, his grip tightening before reluctantly releasing, and he looked up at her with eyes that held something raw and unguarded, and he said roughly, "Thank you for listening." And Eleanor understood that he had given her something precious, something he had never given anyone, and she carried the warmth of his hand in hers all the way back to her chamber, pressing her palm against her heart as though she could hold it there forever. 2 months had passed since Eleanor had spoken her wedding vows, and the world beyond the windows of Thornton Hall had begun its slow surrender to winter, the trees shedding the last of their golden leaves and the air carrying that particular sharpness that spoke of frost to come. And on this morning William had appeared at the breakfast table with an announcement that made her heart flutter with something between anticipation and dread. He wished her to accompany him to the village, to be seen among the people who would look to her as their duchess. And though the prospect of facing the world beyond the estate's protective walls stirred old fears she had thought buried, Eleanor had nodded her assent and gone to dress in the deep blue wool gown that Mrs. Hartwell had declared most becoming, and within the hour she found herself seated beside her husband in the carriage as it wound down the familiar road toward the cluster of cottages and shops that comprised the village of Hartwell. The reception that awaited her was nothing like what she had feared, nothing like the cutting glances and whispered cruelties she remembered from that long-ago garden party, for the villagers greeted her with genuine warmth, the baker's wife pressing a fresh loaf into her hands with a smile, the blacksmith's daughter curtsying and thanking her for the blankets she had sent when the child fell ill, the elderly widow from the cottage near the mill clasping Eleanor's fingers in her gnarled ones, and blessing her for the coal that had appeared at her door when the first cold snap arrived, and Eleanor realized with dawning wonder that her quiet acts of kindness had preceded her, that these people knew her not as the penniless vicar's daughter who had reached above her station, but as the duchess who cared for their welfare. And when she glanced at William, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something soft and wondering in those grey-blue eyes that usually revealed so little. The carriage ride home was quiet, the comfortable silence that had become their custom. But as they neared the gates of Thornton Hall, William reached into his coat and withdrew a small package wrapped in plain brown paper, and he held it out to her with a gesture that was almost uncertain, almost shy, and when she unwrapped it with trembling fingers, she found herself holding a book, a first edition, the leather binding worn soft with age, the gilt lettering still bright enough to read, and she recognized it instantly as the volume of Shakespeare's sonnets she had mentioned to her father months ago, before any of this had begun, before she had ever imagined that the cold Duke of Ashford would become the man who sat beside her now with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the passing trees, as though he could not bear to watch her reaction. And when she looked up at him with tears burning in her eyes, he said only, "I remembered you deserve beautiful things." And the simplicity of those words, the weight of attention and care they represented, broke something open in her chest that she had been trying desperately to keep sealed. That evening, alone in her chamber with the book pressed against her heart, Eleanor sank onto the edge of her bed and pressed her hand flat against her stomach in that old familiar gesture. But this time it was not pain she was holding in, but something far more terrifying. Joy, hope, love, the very emotions she had sworn never to feel again. And she remembered the promise she had made to herself on the day she accepted his proposal, the words she had repeated like a prayer against vulnerability. "I will not love him. I will be grateful. I will be dutiful. I will be content, but I will not love him. I cannot survive that wound twice." And she understood now with terrible clarity that the promise was already broken, had been breaking for weeks in the library, and the rose garden, and the quiet moments when his hand found hers in the darkness. And she loved him. She loved him with a depth that frightened her more than any humiliation Henry Blackwell had ever inflicted, and she could not tell him, could not risk laying her heart bare again, only to have it returned to her in pieces. 10 weeks had passed since Eleanor had spoken her wedding vows, and the invitation to Lord and Lady Pemberton's winter ball had arrived like a summons from a world she had spent 6 years trying to forget, the heavy cream paper with its elegant script seeming to mock her from the silver tray where it lay, and though every instinct urged her to decline, to plead illness or fatigue or any excuse that would keep her safely within the walls of Thornton Hall, she had seen something in William's expression when he mentioned it, a quiet expectation, perhaps even a hope, and so she had allowed Mrs. Hartwell to dress her in a gown of deep emerald silk that made her eyes glow like honey in candlelight, and she had fastened the delicate gold locket at her throat, the one containing his mother's portrait that he had pressed into her hands on their wedding night with words that still echoed in her heart. And she had descended the staircase to find him waiting in the entrance hall, his grey-blue eyes travelling over her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and he had offered her his arm without speaking, but the way his hand covered hers as he led her to the carriage said everything his words did not. The ballroom at Pemberton House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors, until the entire room seemed to shimmer with golden fire, and the heat of so many bodies pressed together in their finest silks and velvets was almost overwhelming, the air thick with perfume and pomade, and the sharp undertone of champagne. And Eleanor felt the old familiar terror rising in her throat, as she recognized face after face from that long-ago garden party, the same people who had witnessed her. Humiliation, who had laughed behind their fans as Henry Blackwell read her most private words aloud for their entertainment, and she pressed her hand flat against her stomach in that unconscious gesture of self-protection. But before the panic could fully take hold, she felt William's hand settle at the small of her back, warm and steady through the silk of her gown, and he leaned close enough that she could smell the familiar comfort of sandalwood and leather, and whispered, "I am here. You are not alone." And something in her chest loosened just enough to let her breathe. They had been in the ballroom for perhaps an hour, William never straying more than an arm's length from her side, his hand returning again and again to that spot at the small of her back as though he could not bear to lose contact with her, when Eleanor saw a figure approaching through the crowd that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Henry Blackwell, Viscount Ashby, his golden hair gleaming in the candlelight, and his blue eyes widening with shock as they took in the sight of her standing beside the Duke of Ashford, and she watched as that shock curdled into something uglier, something petulant and cruel, and she knew with terrible certainty what was coming even before he opened his mouth. "Why, Miss Ashworth," he drawled, deliberately using her maiden name as though her marriage were some fiction he refused to acknowledge, "what an unexpected pleasure to see you here. I had heard rumours that Ashford had taken a wife, but I confess I never imagined it would be you. Tell me, did you employ the same romantic delusions in your pursuit of a duke that you once directed toward me, or have you learned new tricks for reaching above your station?" And the words struck her like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at wounds that had never fully healed, and she felt herself shrinking, diminishing, becoming once again the 17-year-old girl who had stood frozen at the edge of a garden party, while her heart was read aloud for the amusement of strangers. But then William moved, a single fluid step that placed his broad-shouldered form directly between Eleanor and the man who had caused her such pain. And when he spoke, his voice was ice, cold and sharp, and utterly devastating. "You will address my wife as Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashford," William said, each word falling into the sudden silence like a stone into still water. "And you will do so with the respect her position demands, though I suspect respect is a concept foreign to a man who has squandered his inheritance on gambling debts, whose estate is mortgaged to the foundations, whose wife can barely stand to be in the same room with him, and whose only remaining talent appears to be the public humiliation of women who were foolish enough to once believe him worthy of their regard. And Henry's face had gone white, his soft mouth trembling with the petulance that had always lurked beneath his handsome features. But William was not finished, his voice rising just enough that every person within 20 feet could hear him clearly as he continued. "I chose the Duchess of Ashford because she possesses more worth in her smallest gesture than you have demonstrated in your entire existence. Her kindness, her dignity, her grace under circumstances that would have broken a lesser person. These are qualities you could not recognize because you possess none of them yourself. And I will say this once and once only. You will not speak to her again. You will not look at her. If you approach her, if you so much as whisper her name in a tone I find displeasing, I will destroy you, and you know that I have both the means and the will to do so." And the ballroom had fallen utterly silent, the music dying away, as though even the orchestra understood that something momentous was occurring. And Eleanor watched Henry Blackwell stumble backward, his face a mask of humiliated fury, and she understood with stunning clarity that the vow William had made on the day he proposed, "I shall never humiliate you, whatever else this marriage may lack. You will always have my respect and my protection," had just been fulfilled in a way she could never have imagined. And as he turned back to her, his grey-blue eyes soft with concern, even as his jaw remained tight with barely contained anger, she felt something shift in her chest, some final barrier crumbling to dust, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was love, not the naive infatuation she had once felt for a golden-haired boy who had never deserved it, but something deeper and truer and more terrifying, a love built on respect and protection and 1,000 small gestures of care. And she pressed her hand against her stomach, not to hold herself together, but to contain the overwhelming joy that threatened to spill out of her in tears. The cold night air struck Eleanor's flushed cheeks like a benediction as she stepped through the French doors onto the terrace, her lungs aching for breath that did not carry the weight of 100 watching eyes, and she gripped the stone balustrade with trembling fingers and tried to still the violent pounding of her heart, tried to make sense of what had just occurred in that glittering ballroom where the man she had married for security had defended her honor with a ferocity that left no doubt of his regard. And she was so lost in the tumult of her own emotions that she did not hear the soft footsteps approaching, until a voice, sharp and brittle as winter ice, cut through the darkness beside her. "You think yourself unfortunate, Miss Ashworth," Lady Arabella Blackwell said, and Eleanor turned to find Henry's wife standing in the shadows, her beautiful face twisted into an expression of such bitter resignation that it stole the breath from Eleanor's lungs. "I married the man you loved. Trust me when I say. You were the lucky one." And before Eleanor could formulate a response, before she could even fully comprehend the weight of those words, Arabella had turned and disappeared back into the golden light of the ballroom, leaving Eleanor alone with a truth that rewrote everything she had believed about her own past, for she understood now that the rejection which had shattered her 17-year-old heart had been not a tragedy but a deliverance, not a wound but a mercy she had been too blind to recognize. William found her there moments later, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the ballroom as he stepped onto the terrace, and without speaking he removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders, that familiar gesture that had become a language between them, and she breathed in the scent of sandalwood and leather, and felt something in her chest unknot as he guided her toward the waiting carriage, with his hand warm and steady at the small of her back. The interior of the carriage was warm after the bitter cold of the terrace, heated bricks wrapped in flannel placed beneath the seats, and as the horses began their journey home, Eleanor found herself unable to remain silent any longer, the words spilling from her lips before she could stop them. "You did not have to do that," she said, and she watched his jaw tighten in that way she had come to recognize, the way he always looked when emotion threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed walls. "I gave you my word," he replied, his voice clipped and formal, but she would not let him retreat behind duty, not now, not after what she had witnessed. "But that was more than your word," she pressed, and he was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer at all, the only sound the rhythmic clatter of hooves on the frozen road, until finally he turned to look at her, his grey-blue eyes soft as morning mist in the dim light of the carriage lamp, and said simply, "Yes, it was." They did not speak again until the carriage had deposited them in the entrance hall of Thornton Hall, the familiar scent of wood smoke and beeswax candles wrapping around Eleanor like a homecoming, and she had turned toward the staircase that led to her chambers when she felt his hand close around hers, warm and strong, the thin scar across his palm pressing against her fingers. And when she looked back at him, his expression was raw with something that looked almost like fear, and he said, with a difficulty that made each word seem torn from somewhere deep within him, "I find that I do not wish this to be merely an arrangement." And Eleanor could not speak, could not find words adequate to the enormity of what was passing between them, so she simply squeezed his hand in return, pouring everything she felt into that small gesture. And when he raised her fingers to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers, she understood that something fundamental had shifted between them, that they stood now on the threshold of something neither of them had expected to find, and, though the words of love remained unspoken, they hung in the air between them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. 2 weeks had passed since the Pemberton ball. 2 weeks in which the world beyond the windows of Thornton Hall had surrendered fully to winter's grip, the grounds blanketed in frost that glittered like scattered diamonds beneath the pale morning sun, and Eleanor found herself moving through the days in a state of heightened awareness, every nerve attuned to the presence of the man who had defended her honor with such devastating precision, the man who had pressed a kiss to her knuckles and spoken words that still echoed through her dreams. And though neither of them had given voice to the feelings that hung between them like morning mist over still water, something fundamental had shifted in the texture of their days together, revealing itself in touches that lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary, in glances that caught and held across the breakfast table, in the way his hand would find the small of her back whenever they walked together through the corridors, as though he could not bear to be near her without that point of connection. And Eleanor ached with a wanting so fierce it frightened her, a yearning that pressed against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for flight. And yet she could not bring herself to speak the words that trembled on her lips, could not risk shattering this fragile, beautiful thing growing between them by demanding more than he was prepared to give. It was Mrs. Hartwell who finally gave voice to what Eleanor had scarcely dared to believe, finding her one afternoon in the small sitting room where she had been attempting without success to focus on her embroidery. The older woman's stern features softened into something approaching tenderness as she set down the tea-tray and said, with a directness that brooked no argument, "In 30 years I have never seen His Grace look at anyone the way he looks at you, my lady, not once." And Eleanor's needle stilled mid-stitch, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked up to find Mrs. Hartwell watching her with knowing eyes. "You were the making of him, just as I knew you would be. That girl will be the making of him, or the breaking. I said it the day you arrived, and I say it now with certainty. You have brought him back to life." And though Eleanor wanted desperately to believe it, though every fibre of her being longed to accept this benediction, the old wounds ran deep, and she could only whisper her thanks and watch the housekeeper withdraw with tears burning behind her eyes. That evening, as the winter light faded to grey and the cold settled over the grounds like a shroud, Eleanor wrapped herself in her warmest cloak and ventured into the dormant rose garden, drawn by some instinct she could not name to the stone bench where his mother's initials were carved, the letters M.T. worn smooth by decades of weather and grief, and she knelt in the frozen earth to clear away the dead leaves that had gathered there, her fingers growing numb with cold as she worked, and she did not hear his approach until his shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find William standing beside her, his breath visible in the frigid air, his grey-blue eyes fixed on those carved letters, with an expression of such raw longing that her heart clenched painfully in her chest, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them filled only with the whisper of wind through bare branches and the distant call of winter birds, until at last he lowered himself to sit beside her on the cold stone, their shoulders almost touching, the warmth of him radiating through the layers of wool and velvet that separated them. And he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "She would have loved you." And Eleanor felt something break open inside her, some final wall crumbling to dust, and she reached out without thinking to take his hand, his fingers closing around hers with desperate strength, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, two souls who had found each other against all odds, neither willing to break the sacred silence that held them, and Eleanor understood that she loved him with a ferocity that terrified her, loved him beyond reason or caution or self-preservation, and though the words remained unspoken, she knew with absolute certainty that she could not keep them inside much longer. 3 days had passed since that evening in the rose garden, 3 days in which Eleanor had moved through the familiar rhythms of Thornton Hall like a woman caught in a waking dream, her thoughts circling endlessly around the memory of his hand clasping hers on that cold stone bench, his voice rough with emotion as he spoke of his mother, the warmth of his shoulder pressed against hers in the gathering darkness. And now she lay in her bed with the covers twisted around her restless limbs, sleep an impossibility when her heart would not cease its relentless pounding, when every time she closed her eyes she saw his face, those grey-blue eyes soft as morning mist, and she could no longer pretend, could no longer maintain the careful fiction she had constructed to protect herself, for the truth was blazing through her like wildfire, consuming every defense she had ever built, and she threw back the covers and rose to pace the length of her chambers, her bare feet cold against the polished floorboards, her nightgown whispering against her ankles as she moved back and forth before the dying fire, and she pressed her hand flat against her stomach in that old familiar gesture, trying to hold herself together as the admission she had been fighting for weeks finally broke through the last of her resistance. She loved him with a ferocity that stole the breath from her lungs, loved not the cold and distant duke that society believed him to be, but the man beneath, the man who remembered her favourite books, and placed his coat around her shoulders and spoke to grieving farmers with such unexpected gentleness, the man whose hands shook when he was afraid, and whose laughter transformed his stern face into something beautiful. She loved his quiet care, and his fierce protection, and his hidden tenderness, loved the way he watched her when he thought she was not looking, loved the sound of her name in his deep voice, and the knowledge of it terrified her beyond measure. She stopped before the window, watching the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain, and she remembered the promise she had made to herself on the day she accepted his proposal, standing alone in her father's garden, with her future stretching before her like an uncertain road. "I will not love him," she had sworn. "I will be grateful, I will be dutiful, I will be content, but I will not love him. I cannot survive that wound twice." And now that promise lay in ruins at her feet, shattered beyond any hope of repair, for she had broken it utterly, had given her heart to a man who might never return it, and the wound was already forming. She could feel it opening in her chest like a flower blooming in darkness, and whether he loved her or merely felt obligation and desire, she was already lost, already drowning in feelings too vast to contain. She could not stay in this room, could not bear the silence and the shadows and the relentless circling of her own thoughts, and so she wrapped herself in her dressing gown and slipped into the corridor, her feet carrying her without conscious direction through the darkened halls of Thornton Hall, past the portraits of his ancestors and the closed doors of empty rooms, until she found herself standing before the library, that sacred space where he had first touched her elbow during a storm, so like the one now approaching. And she pushed open the door and stepped inside to find him there, silhouetted against the window, where lightning flickered on the horizon, and when he turned at the sound of her entrance, his face was raw and unguarded in a way she had never seen, stripped of every defense, and the need in his eyes made her heart stop in her chest, and he said her name, not Miss Ashworth, not Madam, but simply Eleanor. And the way he spoke it, low and rough and reverent, changed everything. The storm broke with a violence that seemed to mirror the tempest raging within her chest, rain lashing against the tall library windows with such ferocity that the glass shuddered in its frames, and Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still resting on the door she had pushed open, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it across the length of the room. And William did not move from his position at the window, his broad shoulders rigid beneath the fine linen of his shirt, his silhouette stark against the flashes of lightning that illuminated the grounds beyond, and the tension between them, stretched taut as a bowstring, unbearable in its intensity, the air thick with all the words that had gone unspoken for weeks, for months, since the very first moment he had placed his coat around her shoulders in the carriage, and she had breathed in the scent of sandalwood and leather, and felt something dangerous stir to life in her carefully guarded heart. And when at last he spoke, his voice was rough, halting, the words dragged from some place deep within him that he had kept locked away for so long. "I have tried," he said, still facing the window, still watching the storm as though he could not bear to look at her. "I have tried to maintain the terms of our arrangement, to want nothing more than what I promised you, respect and protection, and a life free from humiliation. I gave you my word that I would ask nothing more. And I meant it, Eleanor. I meant every word." And the sound of her name on his lips, spoken with such aching tenderness, made her press her hand flat against her stomach, in that old familiar gesture, holding herself together as he continued, his voice growing rougher still. "But I have failed utterly, because I find I cannot be near you without wanting more. I cannot watch you across the breakfast table, or walk beside you in the gardens, or sit with you in this very room without wanting—" And here he stopped, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching at his sides, and when he finally turned to face her, the raw need in his grey-blue eyes stole the breath from her lungs. "I cannot watch you and not—" He tried again, but the words seemed to desert him, and it was then that Eleanor saw what she had never expected to see, what shattered every remaining defence around her heart. His hands were shaking, trembling visibly at his sides, this man who had faced down Henry Blackwell with devastating precision, who commanded an estate and spoke with cold authority that made lesser men quail, whose very presence filled a room with power and certainty, and his hands were shaking because he was afraid of her, afraid of what she might say, afraid of rejection, and she understood with stunning clarity that his heart was as vulnerable as her own, that beneath the stern exterior and the careful control lay a man who had been wounded too, who had built walls just as high as hers, and who was now standing before her with those walls crumbling to dust, offering her everything he was, and terrified that it would not be enough. The lightning flashed again, illuminating the library in stark white brilliance, and in that moment of sudden clarity Eleanor's gaze caught on something she had not noticed before, something that made her breath catch in her throat and her heart stutter against her ribs. There on the desk, arranged in a delicate crystal vase that caught the flickering light of the dying fire, stood a spray of white jasmine, its sweet fragrance reaching her across the room like a whispered secret. And she remembered, with devastating precision, the afternoon she had mentioned it to Mrs. Hartwell, just once, in passing, speaking of the vicarage wall where the jasmine had grown wild, and how she had spent countless hours reading beneath its trailing blooms. And he had remembered, he had listened. He had arranged this room with the storm gathering outside, and the fire burning low, and her favourite flower perfuming the air, recreating the very conditions of that first night when his hand had steadied her elbow and everything had begun to change, and the realization of what this meant, of the depth of attention and care it revealed, broke something open within her that she had not known was still locked away. She moved before she could think, her feet carrying her across the library toward him, closing the distance between them step by step, and the words rose unbidden to her lips, the lines she had read 100 times in the poetry book he had given her, the words that had become her secret prayer in the quiet hours of the night. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments," she said softly, and she watched his eyes widen, those grey-blue depths warming to something like wonder as recognition dawned across his features. "You know it," she breathed, and his voice when he answered was rough with emotion, barely above a whisper. "I know it. I have read it 100 times since I gave it to you, trying to understand what you found in those words, trying to understand you." And he reached for her then, his trembling hands finding hers and holding them as though she were something infinitely precious, something he feared might slip away. And when he spoke again, his voice cracked on the words, "I promised you respect and protection. I gave you my word that I would never humiliate you, that whatever else this marriage might lack, you would always have my honor and my shield. But I did not know then, Eleanor, I could not have known that I would come to offer you everything I am, every broken piece of me, every wall I have built, and every fear I have hidden. I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you, I think, since the moment you stood in your father's parlor and looked at me without fear or calculation, since you met my coldness with quiet dignity and saw something in me that I had forgotten existed. I love you, and I am terrified of it, terrified because I do not know how to do this, how to be this, how to give you what you deserve when I have spent so long believing myself incapable of such feeling." And the rain lashed against the windows, and the thunder rolled across the sky, and Eleanor stood before him with tears streaming down her cheeks, her heart so full she thought it might shatter from the weight of it. And she understood at last that love was not the grand declarations she had once dreamed of as a girl, but this trembling honesty, this terrified offering of a wounded heart to another wounded heart, and she was no longer afraid. Eleanor lifted her, hands to his face, her fingers trembling as they traced the hard line of his jaw, the sharp planes of his cheekbones, learning the geography of a face she had studied in secret for months. And when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, raw with the weight of everything she had carried alone for so long. "I made myself a promise the day I accepted your proposal, standing in my father's garden with the autumn wind cutting through my shawl and my heart already bruised from the wound Henry Blackwell had dealt me 6 years before. I told myself I would not love you, that I would be grateful and dutiful and content. But I would not love you, because I could not survive that wound twice. I could not bear to give my heart again, only to have it crushed beneath indifference or cruelty." And she watched his grey-blue eyes darken with something fierce and protective as she continued, "But I broke that promise weeks ago, perhaps months ago. I have loved you, I think, since I watched you speak to that grieving farmer with such gentleness, since you crouched down to meet his smallest child at eye level and promised help without condescension, since you gave me your coat in the carriage on our wedding day, and I breathed in the scent of sandalwood and leather, and felt something dangerous stir to life in my chest, since you remembered my books and my jasmine, and every small thing I mentioned in passing. I have loved you, William, and I was terrified too, terrified that you could never feel for me what I felt for you, that I would spend my life loving a man who saw me only as a practical arrangement." And she never finished the thought, because his mouth found hers with a desperation that stole the breath from her lungs, his hands tangling in her hair and sending pins scattering across the library floor as her chestnut waves tumbled loose around her shoulders. And the kiss was not gentle. It was consuming, devouring, the release of months of longing and years of guarded hearts, finally surrendering to the truth that had grown between them in quiet moments and stolen glances, and the brush of fingers across a shared book, and Eleanor responded with equal intensity, her arms winding around his neck, pulling him closer, closer still, as though she could press herself into him and never be separated again. And when at last they broke apart, they were both trembling, foreheads pressed together, breath mingling in the warm air of the library, while the storm raged beyond the windows. And he lifted her then, carried her through the darkened corridors of Thornton Hall to the chambers that had stood empty beside hers since their wedding night, and there in the warmth of a fire that blazed against the cold, with rain lashing the windows and thunder rolling across the sky, they came together at last, his hands reverent on her skin, her fingers tracing the scar across his palm, every touch a promise, every whispered word a vow more binding than any they had spoken in the church. And when Eleanor finally lay in his arms with his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek and his scent surrounding her like a benediction, she understood that love was not the grand romantic fantasy she had dreamed of as a girl of 17, but something far more precious. It was choosing and being chosen. It was small kindnesses remembered and acted upon. It was two wounded hearts finding shelter in each other, and she had never been more grateful to have been wrong about anything in her entire life. The month that followed their confession passed in a haze of quiet joy that Eleanor had never dared imagine for herself. Mornings that began with his arm heavy and warm across her waist, and his lips pressed to the curve of her shoulder. Afternoons spent walking the grounds with Wellington trotting at their heels. Evenings in the library, where they read together in companionable silence, or talked for hours about everything and nothing. And the change in William was visible to everyone who had known him before, for he smiled now, not often but genuinely, the stern lines of his face softening when his gaze found her across a room, and he touched her constantly. Small gestures of connection that seemed almost unconscious. His hand finding the small of her back as they walked, his fingers brushing hers when he passed her a cup of tea, his arm settling around her shoulders when they sat together before the fire. And Mrs. Hartwell, who had watched over him since his boyhood, observed these changes with eyes that grew suspiciously bright. And one morning in the breakfast room, when the early spring sunshine poured through the windows, and the first crocuses were pushing through the frost-softened earth outside, the housekeeper approached Eleanor with a warmth that would have been unthinkable 3 months before, and said quietly, "You were the making of him, my lady, just as I knew you would be. I said it the night you arrived, and I have never been more pleased to be proven right." And Eleanor remembered overhearing those very words on that first stormy evening, the prediction that had seemed so presumptuous then, and now felt like prophecy fulfilled. And she thanked Mrs. Hartwell with tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, understanding that she had not only gained a husband, but a family, a place where she truly belonged. The spring gathering at Lord and Lady Pemberton's estate arrived on a day of almost impossible brightness, the gardens bursting with daffodils and hyacinths that perfumed the warm air. And Eleanor entered on William's arm, wearing a gown of pale green silk that brought out the honey warmth in her amber-brown eyes, the delicate gold locket with his mother's portrait resting against her heart, as it had every day since their wedding night, and she felt the weight of 100 gazes upon them as they moved through the glittering assembly. But where once such attention would have made her shrink with remembered shame, now she stood tall. Beside her husband, her spine straight, her chin level, secure in the knowledge that she was loved, and the whispers that followed them were not cruel but envious, admiring. For the Duke of Ashford danced only with his wife, his hand possessive and tender at her waist as he guided her through the figures, his grey-blue eyes never leaving her face, and society witnessed what Eleanor had come to know in private, that this cold, stern man had been transformed by love, into something warm and devoted and fierce in his adoration. And she caught glimpses of Henry Blackwell at the edges of the gathering, his golden hair dulled somehow, his handsome face bearing the marks of discontent and debt, and a marriage grown bitter with disappointment. And when their eyes met briefly across the crowded room, Eleanor saw in his expression the bitter recognition of what he had discarded, the regret that would follow him all his days. But she found no satisfaction in his misery, only a profound and overwhelming gratitude for the path that had led her here, to this moment, to this man, whose hand tightened on her waist, as if he could not bear even the space of a breath between them. And she understood at last that the girl who had burned a letter 6 years ago had not been a fool for loving. She had simply been waiting, without knowing it, for someone worthy of her heart. 5 years had passed since that storm-swept night in the library, when 2 guarded hearts had finally spoken their truth, and the nursery at Thornton Hall now held the most precious evidence of that love. A son of 4 years, with his father's striking grey-blue eyes and serious temperament, and a daughter of 2 with Eleanor's chestnut waves and a laugh that could coax a smile from even the most stoic of servants. And on this summer afternoon, Eleanor stood in the doorway watching William read to them, his deep voice soft with a tenderness that would have astonished anyone who remembered the cold, stern Duke of years past. For he sat in the low chair by the window, with their daughter nestled in his lap, and their son pressed against his side. And he was reading from the very book of poetry he had given Eleanor all those years ago, the first edition containing Sonnet 116, and though the children were too young to understand the words, they listened with rapt attention to the music of their father's voice, and Eleanor pressed her hand to her heart, where the delicate gold locket rested against her skin. The locket that now contained not only the miniature portrait of William's mother, but also a tiny curl of their daughter's hair, copper brown and soft as silk, and she thought of how full her life had become, how rich with love and purpose and belonging. And later that afternoon she walked to the rose garden that she had restored from its wild overgrowth into something magnificent, the blooms heavy and fragrant in the summer heat, white and pink and deepest crimson, tumbling over arbours and climbing the ancient stone walls, and she sat upon the bench with the carved initials M.T. worn smooth by time and weather, and she was not alone for long because her father came to join her, walking slowly now with the aid of a cane, his hair fully white and his frame grown frail, but his eyes still bright with the gentle wisdom she had known all her life. And he lowered himself onto the bench beside her and looked out over the garden she had created from love and patience and care. And he smiled that knowing smile she remembered from the grey autumn morning when he had spoken of unexpected instruments, and he said quietly, "God works through unexpected instruments, my dear. Did I not say so? And here is the proof of it all around us, in these roses, in those children, in the joy that lights your face whenever you look at your husband." And Eleanor took his weathered hand in hers, and could not speak for the tears that tightened her throat. But he understood. He had always understood, and they sat together in peaceful silence as the afternoon light turned golden and the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. That evening, as the summer storm broke over Thornton Hall with all its magnificent fury, Eleanor and William stood at the library window, watching the lightning illuminate the grounds in brilliant flashes, the rain streaming down the glass and the thunder shaking the ancient stones, and she leaned back against his chest as his arms wrapped around her, solid and warm and sure. And she thought of another storm, years ago, when his hand had steadied her elbow in this very room, and she had felt the first dangerous stirring of something she had sworn never to feel again. And she thought of the woman she had been then, wounded and wary and so determined not to love, and she marvelled at how wrong she had been, how gloriously, blessedly wrong, for she had found in this man not the cold arrangement she had expected, but a love that had grown from respect into passion, from duty into devotion, from two strangers standing in a vicarage parlour into this. Two hearts so intertwined that she could no longer remember what it had felt like to be alone. And William pressed his lips to her hair and murmured against her temple, "What are you thinking?" And she turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his jaw as she had done 1,000 times before. And she said simply, "I am thinking that I am grateful for the storm that brought us together, for every storm since, for you." And his grey-blue eyes, soft as morning mist over still water, held hers as he said, "As am I, Eleanor, as am I." The storm had passed, and the house had grown quiet. The children long since tucked into their beds, with kisses pressed to their foreheads, and promises of adventures tomorrow, and Eleanor sat alone in the library before the fire that crackled softly in the grate, the flames casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with books she had come to know as intimately as the rooms of her childhood home, and in this stillness she allowed herself to do what she rarely did any more, to look backward, to trace the path that had led her from that grey autumn evening, when she had burned a letter and sworn never to love again, to this moment of such profound contentment that it sometimes frightened her with its completeness. And she thought of the girl she had been at 17, so young and so certain that love was a grand and sweeping thing that announced itself with poetry and passion. And she thought of how that girl had been shattered by cruelty, by Henry Blackwell, reading her innocent words aloud to laughing crowds. And she understood now with the wisdom of years that his rejection had been a gift wrapped in the cruelest paper, for it had saved her from a life of shallow misery with a man who measured worth only in fortune and status, and it had led her, eventually, inexorably, to William, to the man who had placed his coat around her shoulders in a cold carriage without comment, who had steadied her with his hand at her elbow during a storm, and released her slowly, as if reluctant to let go, who had remembered the books she loved and the flowers she favoured, and had arranged white jasmine on a desk in a storm-dark library, because he had been listening, always listening, to the small truths she scattered like seeds, without knowing she was planting a garden. And she understood now what love truly was, not the grand declarations she had dreamed of as a girl, but the consistent, quiet, daily choosing of another person's happiness, the 1,000 small gestures that accumulated into something unshakable, the coat and the touch, and the books, and the jasmine, and the way he still looked at her across crowded rooms as if she were the only person in the world worth seeing. And she thought of her father's words about unexpected instruments, and how right he had been. And she thought of Mrs. Hartwell's prediction about making or breaking, and how she had somehow, miraculously, been the making. And she pressed her hand to the locket at her throat, and felt the warmth of the gold against her skin, and knew that she was home, truly home, in a way she had never dared hope for. And so to you who have walked this path beside Eleanor, who have felt her wounds and shared her fears and celebrated her joy, there is gratitude beyond what words can hold, for stories are meant to be shared, and love is meant to be witnessed, and perhaps somewhere in this tale of two guarded hearts learning to trust, there is hope for your own journey, for love grown from respect and kindness and the patient tending of small moments, for the warmth that waits beneath the coldest exterior for those brave enough to look, and may you find your own unexpected instrument, your own storm-swept confession, your own library filled with firelight and peace and the quiet certainty of being chosen, being cherished, being loved.